in Martin Falls had ever seen the old man move faster than the pace of cooling maple syrup. Constable Brenda Foss leaned against the hood of her cruiser, watching the cabin at the end of Lakeshore Road through a pair of binoculars that were older than she was. The cabin sat on a spit of rock jutting into the gray expanse of Lake Nipigon, a modest structure of peeled logs and green tin roofing. The kind of place that looked like it had simply grown out of the Canadian Shield the way birch trees do, without asking permission. The man who lived there was named Arthur Greaves. He was 73 years old. He had a white beard trimmed close to the jaw, hands like knotted rope, and a way of looking at you that made you feel like he already knew what you were about to say and had decided it wasn't worth hearing. A vegetable garden. He smoked lake trout on a rack he'd built from an old bed frame. He had a dog, a massive Newfoundland with a torn ear named Bishop, who followed him everywhere with the solemn loyalty of a monk attending Vespers. "It's just sitting on the dock again," Foss said into her radio. "Hasn't moved in 40 minutes. Sergeant Tremblay's voice came back, tight and clipped. "Copy. Keep eyes on. Don't approach." As the 5th day. 5 days since a group of armed men had seized the Whitmore Mining Survey Camp 12 kilometers north of town, all up in the bush where the old logging roads turned to moose trails and then to nothing. They called themselves the Northern Shield. Grievances about mineral rights, about ancestral land, about corporate greed. And they had chosen to express those grievances by taking 4 Whitmore employees hostage and wiring the access road with enough explosive to flip a Bison armored vehicle. The Ontario Provincial Police had sent their tactics and rescue unit. The RCMP had sent negotiators. Nobody had sent good news. The nation had calcified into the worst possible shape. A standoff where the hostage-takers had the terrain, the weather, and a set of demands that no level of government could meet without setting a precedent that would haunt them for decades. The bush was thick boreal forest, black spruce, and jack pine so dense you could lose a company of soldiers in it within 50 meters. November air was sharp enough to cut glass, and the days were shrinking fast, each one losing another 12 minutes of light. Every tactical option the OPP had war-gamed ended the same way. High-risk, probable casualties, and a political firestorm that would make the Oka crisis look like a neighborhood dispute. Atchfields. Into this mess had walked Inspector Gavin Rourke of the RCMP's Integrated National Security Enforcement Team. He arrived in Martin Falls by helicopter, wearing a suit that cost more than Constable Foss made in a month, and carrying the particular brand of confidence that comes from never having been told no by anyone who mattered. He had sharp features, a precise haircut, and the unsettling habit of referring to the hostage situation as the file, as though 4 terrified human beings were a matter of paperwork. "Who's the hermit?" Rourke asked on his first morning, standing at the window of the community center they'd converted into a command post, looking down the road toward the lake. Sergeant Tremblay had policed this stretch of northern Ontario for 22 years, looked up from his coffee. "Arthur Greaves, retired. Lives alone out on the point. Been here since, must be the early 90s. He's inside the security perimeter. I relocated. I mentioned that to him on day 2. And?" Tremblay took a slow sip of his coffee. "He said no." Rourke stared at him. "He said no. He said, and I'm quoting here, 'I'm not leaving my dog. And Bishop doesn't like car rides.'" Then he went back to splitting wood. Rourke's expression hardened into the look of a man who had just discovered a crease in a freshly pressed shirt. "This isn't a request. We're moving tactical assets through that corridor tonight. I need that road clear and that cabin dark." "You're welcome to go tell him yourself, Inspector." Rourke buttoned his jacket and walked out the door. Tremblay watched him go, then looked at Foss, who had been standing in the corner, pretending to organize files. "Should we warn Greaves?" she asked. "No," Tremblay said, the ghost of a smile crossing his face. "Uzi far. I think this is something the inspector needs to experience firsthand." Rourke drove the 800 meters to the cabin because walking would have meant ruining his shoes on the frozen mud. He parked behind the OPP cruiser at the roadblock, nodded curtly to the constable manning it, and walked the last 100 meters down the lane. The Newfoundland saw him first, fours. Bishop raised his enormous head from his paws, considered the approaching figure, and evidently decided he was beneath notice. The dog lowered his head and went back to sleep. Arthur Greaves was sitting on a wooden bench he'd built into the south-facing wall of his cabin, positioned to catch the last thin warmth of the November sun. He wore a flannel shirt, a down vest, and a pair of work pants so faded they were the color of dishwater. He was sharpening a filleting knife on a whetstone, a rhythmic scraping sound carrying clearly in the still air. He did not look up as Rourke approached. "Mr. I'm Inspector Rourke, RCMP. I heard you coming from the road," Greaves said, not looking up from the blade. "You drive with your window cracked. Means you're not from here. Locals keep their windows up. Cold gets in the seals otherwise." Rourke paused, momentarily thrown. He recovered quickly. "Sir, I need to inform you that this area has been designated a tactical operations zone. For your safety, we require you to evacuate to temporary accommodation in town. Transport has been arranged." The scraping of the knife continued, slow, deliberate, almost musical. The sound of a man who had sharpened 10,000 blades and intended to sharpen 10,000 more. "That's the first time," Greaves said. Tremblay said the same thing, just with better manners. "This isn't negotiable." Greaves finally looked up. His eyes were pale gray, color of lake ice, in early December, and they settled on Rourke with a weight that felt physical. The inspector had interrogated arms dealers in Montreal, drug lords in Vancouver, and a Russian intelligence officer in a windowless room in Ottawa. None of them had looked at him the way this old man did. It wasn't hostile. It was something worse. It was the look of a man taking your precise measure and finding you came up short. "Son," Greaves said, and the word carried no condescension, a kind of tired gentleness. "I've been on this land for 31 years. Before me, it was my wife's family's land for 3 generations. She's buried in the garden, next to the birch she planted when our daughter was born. That daughter's buried in Kandahar. Understand when I tell you that I'm not leaving, because a man in a nice suit asked me to." The words landed like stones dropped into still water. Rourke opened his mouth, closed it, and for the first time in his career found himself without a response. The mention of Kandahar, of a daughter lost in a war he himself had never fought, had shifted the ground beneath him in a way he couldn't articulate. He tried once more, his voice losing some of its edge. "For your loss, Mr. Greaves. But these men are dangerous. They have military-grade equipment, improvised explosives, and they've made it clear they're prepared to die." Fields Greaves resumed sharpening the knife. "I know what they have. I know exactly what they have. That's impossible. Classified operational intelligence." "I can hear it," Greaves said simply. "Their generator. It's a Lister diesel, British military surplus. I hear it running at night when the wind comes from the north. Deer or... And their radio traffic, they think they're being clever with their frequency hopping. They're using a pattern I designed 35 years ago." Rourke blinked. "I'm sorry, you what?" Greaves didn't answer. Edges females. He tested the edge of the knife against his thumbnail, nodded to himself, and slid it into a leather sheath. "You should get back to your command post, Inspector. You've got a long night ahead of you." Jeff walked back to his vehicle in a kind of daze. The old man's words rattled around in his head like loose hardware in a toolbox. "A pattern I designed. What did that even mean?" He was a fisherman, a hermit, a man who talked to his dog and sharpened knives. Back at the command post, the situation was deteriorating. Corporal Landry, the communications specialist, was hunched over a bank of equipment, her face tight with frustration. They're jamming again, she reported when Rourke walked in. Every time we find a clean frequency, they shift. It's not random. Someone in that camp knows signals intelligence. Honestly, sir, it's elegant. Old school, but incredibly effective. That's like fighting someone who learned to box from the inventor of boxing. Tremblay watched Rourke's face carefully. Something was happening behind the inspector's eyes. A connection being made existed. What do we know about Greaves? Rourke asked quietly. His background. Tremblay leaned back in his chair. He moved here in '92. Bought the land from the Aiken estate. Paid cash. Himself. Married Donna Whitfield from Red Rock. She died in '08. Cancer. Now was Captain Sarah Greaves, Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry. Killed by an IED outside Kandahar City in 2010. After that, he got even quieter. Before '92. What was he doing? Billy shrugged. Nobody ever asked. He's not the kind of man you ask. That's not an answer. No, Tremblay agreed. It's not. But it's all I've got. Yes, Rourke pulled out his phone and made a call. Then another. Then a third. Each call went higher, each conversation shorter. On the fourth call, he spoke for 2 minutes, mostly listening, and when he hung up, his face had gone the color of birch bark. Surgeon, he said, his voice oddly flat, "I'd to speak with you privately." They stepped into the kitchen of the community center. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead. Rourke leaned against the counter and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "I just spoke with the Assistant Deputy Minister of National Defense. And I mentioned Greaves's name. There was a silence on the line that lasted. I'm not exaggerating. 15 seconds. Then he told me to hold. The next voice I heard was the Chief of Defense Staff. A said nothing. He waited. The CDS told me 3 things. First, that Arthur Greaves does not exist in any database I have access to. Second, the name Greaves came up in connection with my operation. I was to extend him every professional courtesy. The third, and this is a direct quote, if that man offers to help, you say yes, and you say thank you. The kitchen was very quiet. The fluorescent light buzzed. He wouldn't tell me anything else, it continued. But I got the impression that the CDS was, I don't know how to describe it. He wasn't nervous. He was reverent. Like I'd accidentally mentioned a saint. Took a long breath and let it out slowly. So what do we do? I have no idea, Rourke admitted. It's perhaps the most honest thing he had ever said. The answer came at 11 that night. Arthur Greaves had not moved from his cabin. But inside it, dusty fields. In the back room that he kept locked with a deadbolt and that no visitor had ever entered, he had been very busy. The room was small, no bigger than a closet, and it was lined with acoustic foam that had yellowed with age, but still dampened sound to a whisper. A workbench ran along one wall. Sat a piece of equipment that looked like it belonged in a museum. A military communications array. Canadian Forces issue, circa 1987. It was bulky, ugly, and covered in handwritten labels in grease pencil. It was also, in its way, a work of art. Greaves had built it himself, soldering every connection, winding every coil, and every frequency by hand. It had been state-of-the-art once. Now it was an antique, like a Stradivarius in a world of electric violins. Its craftsmanship transcended its age. He powered it up. The tubes, actual vacuum tubes, took 90 seconds to warm. He used that time to attach a wire antenna that ran up through a conduit in the wall and emerged from the cabin's roof, disguised as a lightning rod. He'd installed it the week he moved in, 1 year ago, the way a man might install a fire extinguisher. Not because he expected to need it, as not having it was unthinkable. He put on a headset. The static filled his ears, and for a moment he was 26 again, lying in a hide on a frozen ridge in Norway, listening for Soviet submarine communications while the northern lights painted the sky green above him. He was 31, crouched in a bombed-out building in Beirut, his own, relaying coordinates to an extraction team, while the city burned around him. He was 40, standing in a room in Ottawa that didn't appear on any floor plan, ever, briefing the Prime Minister on a threat that never made the newspapers because he and his team had stopped it before it had a name. He pushed the memories down. They were seductive, those ghosts. They whispered that the man he'd been was more real than the man he'd become. But the man he'd become had a vegetable garden and a dog and 31 years of quiet mornings watching the lake. That man was real too. That man was the one he'd chosen. But tonight, choice was a luxury. Tonight, 4 people were going to die in the bush, unless somebody did something that nobody in that command post was equipped to do, and scanning frequencies. Not the ones the hostage takers were broadcasting on. He knew those already. He'd been listening to them for 5 days. The way a conductor listens to an orchestra warming up is a hearing. Not the individual instruments, but the shape of the whole. No, he was looking for something else. A frequency that existed in no manual, on no spectrum chart, in no database that any signals intelligence agency in the world maintained. A frequency that had been set aside 40 years ago by a man who believed that one day everything would go sideways, and when it did, the old ways would be the only ways left. That man had been Arthur Greaves, and the frequency was still there, a ghost channel buried so deep in the electromagnetic spectrum that finding it was like hearing a single heartbeat in a stadium full of noise. He found it, L carrier wave, steady as a pulse. He locked onto it and pressed the transmit key. His voice when he spoke was not the voice of the old fisherman. It was clipped, precise, of everything personal. A voice built for one purpose: to be heard clearly by the right ears and no others. L Sentinel, this is Watchkeeper Actual. Authenticate. Foxtrot Romeo Oscar Sierra Tango. How copy? The static hissed. 5 seconds. 10, 15. Then a voice came back, young, sharp, unmistakably startled. Unidentified station. You are transmitting on a secure Joint Task Force channel. State your authority. Get your commanding officer, Greaves said, his voice unchanged, as Watchkeeper is on the line. Authentication Foxtrot Romeo Oscar Sierra Tango. He'll know what it means. He released the key. The authentication code for deep cover field operators of the Canadian Special Operations Regiment. A code that predated CSOR itself, that reached back to the days when Canada's most secret soldiers operated under designations that were burned after every mission. The silence stretched. Just could picture the scene. A young signals operator in a windowless room at CFB Trenton or Petawawa, staring at a screen showing a transmission that shouldn't exist on a frequency that wasn't supposed to be real. From a call sign that had been retired before the operator was born. The frantic call to a superior. The superior's disbelief. The search through classified archives so old they might still be on paper. 2 minutes passed. When the voice returned, it was different. Older, controlled. The voice of someone who had been woken from a deep sleep and was now very, very awake. Watchkeeper, this is Sentinel Command. We have confirmed your authentication. Stand by for the CO. A pause. 30 seconds. Then a new voice. And this one carried the particular calm of a man who commanded JTF2, Canada's Tier 1 Special Operations Force. Watchkeeper, this is Arrowhead 6. Have you? It's been a long time, sir. Greaves closed his eyes. The word sir hit him like a fist. He hadn't been sir to anyone in 3 decades. Long enough, he said. I have a situation briefing for you. Requesting immediate assistance, Northern Ontario, reference follows. We're aware of the situation, Arrowhead 6 said. We've been monitoring. We were not tasked. You're being tasked now, Greaves said. By me. It was a pause that contained an entire conversation. Greaves understood it perfectly. JTF2 had been watching the standoff, had the capability to resolve it. But no one in the chain of command had authorized their deployment, as deploying Tier 1 assets on Canadian soil against Canadian citizens was a political grenade that no minister wanted to touch. The OPP and RCMP were supposed to handle it. Except they couldn't. Keeper. The voice came back carefully. You understand the authorities required for domestic deployment. I understand them better than you do, Greaves said. I helped write them. Yes. Use my name. Tell him what I'm asking. He'll make the call. The line went quiet again. Greaves waited. Bishop had padded into the room and was lying at his feet, dog's warmth against his ankles. The cabin creaked in the wind. The lake, invisible in the darkness outside, made soft sounds against the rocks, ancient rhythm of water that had been wearing down granite for 10,000 years. 7 minutes later, Arrowhead 6 returned. Watchkeeper, we are authorized. 2 assault elements plus enablers. ETA your location, 90 minutes. Copy, Greaves said. I'll have a full ground brief ready. One more thing. RCMP liaison at the command post. Inspector Rourke. He needs to stand down all electronic emissions and pull his people back. They're lighting up the area like a Christmas tree. The hostage takers can see every move they make. Understood. Handle the deconfliction. Watchkeeper out. He switched off the set. The tubes dimmed and died. The room was dark and silent. He sat for a moment with his hand on Bishop's head in the dog's slow breathing. Then he stood, his knees protesting the cold, and walked into his kitchen. He put the kettle on. If JTF2 was coming, they'd want coffee when they arrived. Always wanted coffee. At the command post, Inspector Rourke's satellite phone rang. He answered it, listened for less than a minute, and when he lowered the phone, his hand was shaking. He looked at Sergeant Tremblay. Kill everything. All radios, all electronics, all lights. Now. What? Because I've just been told to by people who outrank everyone I've ever met in my career. He paused. And because the man on the ground has it under control. Tremblay stared at him. The man on the ground, Greaves. The name fell into the room like a stone into water. Corporal Landry looked up from her equipment. The 2 OPP tactical officers standing by the door exchanged glances. Who is he? Tremblay asked. Rourke shook his head slowly. I don't know. Not entirely. But whoever he is, he just made one radio call and mobilized the most classified unit in the Canadian military. And apparently they're coming because he asked them to, as though he were calling in a personal favor. The command post went dark. Every screen, every radio, every light in the blackness. And listened to the wind outside, and each of them felt the strange fields. Humbling sensation of realizing they had been playing checkers on a board where someone else had been playing chess all along. Constable Foss, still parked at the roadblock near the cabin, saw it first. At midnight, headlights appeared on the highway, then went dark. She reached for her radio, then remembered the order. Radio silence. She watched through her binoculars as a convoy of vehicles, unmarked, blacked out, moving in a tight formation that spoke of absolute professional discipline, off the highway and onto the Lakeshore Road. They were not police vehicles. They were not military vehicles, not in any configuration she recognized. Civilian trucks and SUVs that had been stripped of anything reflective. Their license plates removed. Their windows tinted beyond any legal standard. It moved without headlights, navigating the frozen dirt road with the confidence of drivers who could see in the dark. They pulled into Greaves's yard and formed a perimeter so precise it looked choreographed. Doors opened. Figures emerged. They moved like water, flowing around obstacles, communicating in gestures and touches, rather than words. They were laden with equipment. Foss couldn't identify dark shapes strapped to dark bodies, and they carried themselves with the particular stillness of people who were very at violence and very, very reluctant to use it unnecessarily. She counted. She stopped at 30. There were more. Fucky fields. Arthur Greaves walked out of his cabin carrying a thermos of coffee and a rolled-up topographical map that looked like it had been hand-drawn. Followed him, tail wagging slowly, as though midnight visitors were a perfectly normal occurrence. A figure separated from the group and approached. She was shorter than Greaves, compact, with cropped dark hair, and a face that looked like it had been carved from the same granite as the shield. She carried no visible rank. She didn't need to. A person in that yard oriented toward her the way iron filings orient toward a magnet. She stopped at the bottom of his porch steps. For a moment they simply looked at each other. Then she spoke, her voice low and clear. "Watchkeeper, Major," Greaves said. He looked past her at the operators arrayed in his yard. "Hill family." "You asked," she said simply. 2 assault teams, snipers, signals, and a combat med section. When the CDS called our CO and said your name, the CO didn't ask questions. He said, "How fast can we get there?" She walked up the steps. Eyes moved across the old man's face, reading it the way she might read terrain. "It's an honor, sir. I studied your operations at the school, the Beirut extraction, the Norway intercepts, in 87 that still doesn't have a name." "It doesn't need one," Greaves said. "Come inside. I've got coffee and a ground brief." They gathered around his kitchen table. The map he unrolled was not a military map. It was a hunter's map, hand annotated over 3 decades, with the kind of detail that comes from walking every meter of ground in every season. Game trails were marked in green pencil, water sources in blue, station changes noted in tiny, precise handwriting, wind patterns, snow depth averages by month, the location of every beaver dam, every deadfall, a patch of muskeg that could swallow a man to his waist. Greaves began his briefing. He didn't look at the map. He didn't need to. He was describing the land the way a father describes his child, with an intimacy that transcended information. Their camp is centered on the old Whitmore survey base here. 5 permanent structures, prefab. They've reinforced with sandbags and felled timber. Main access is this road. He traced a line with his finger. "It's mined. Don't use it. Their generator is here, southeast corner." Lister diesel, loud, as masks sound from the southeast, which means that's your approach corridor. The hostages are being held in the main building, the one with the green roof. I know because their captors talk about it on the radio. They think their encryption is secure. It isn't. I broke it on day 2. A ripple passed through the room. The Major's expression didn't change, but her eyes sharpened. "You've been monitoring their communications for 5 days?" "I've been monitoring everything within 40 kilometers of my home for 31 years, Greaves said, without inflection. "Old habit," continued. "They have 11 personnel, not the 8 your intelligence suggests. 3 are perimeter sentries on rotating 4-hour shifts. Change happens at 0200, 0600, up in 1400. The shift change at 0200 is your window, a 3-minute gap, when the outgoing sentry has left his post and the incoming one hasn't reached it. The northern sentry position is the weakest. It overlooks a ravine they consider impassable," the Major asked. "In summer, no. In November, the creek at the bottom is frozen hard enough to walk on. I checked it last week. 15 centimeters of ice." He looked at her. "Because I went up there." Another silence. Of a 73-year-old man hiking 12 kilometers through boreal bush in November to conduct a reconnaissance of an armed camp settled over the room like snowfall. Leader is the one who knows signals, Greaves continued. Name's Makinen. Former Canadian Forces signals operator, released about 10 years ago. He's smart, as using techniques he learned from a manual. A manual I wrote. The weakness is in the synchronization protocol. At the top of every hour, the frequency hopper resets to its base frequency for 0.6 of a second before beginning the new cycle. In that window, you can inject a false sync pulse and lock their entire network to a dead frequency. They'll lose all internal communications simultaneously. He reached under the table and produced a small black box, no larger than a deck of cards, with a single red button on top. This will do it. I owed it yesterday. The Major looked at the device, then at Greaves. You built a signals jamming device in your cabin. I had the parts, he said. I've always had the parts. I told Donna they were for fixing the ham radio. She never believed me, but she never asked either. That was the deal. He set the device on the table. Press it at 0200, the moment the sentries change. Their comms die. Your assault element goes through the northern ravine. You'll have 3 minutes of total confusion. That's enough. The Major studied the map, running through the plan in her mind. Greaves could see her doing it, testing each element, looking for the flaw, and the same thing 1,000 times. It was like watching his own reflection in a mirror, separated by 40 years. It's good, she said finally. It's very good. I know, Greaves said. There was no arrogance in it. Just the simple honesty of a craftsman assessing his own work. The Major stood. We'll execute at 0200. With your permission, we'll stage from your property. That's why I have the yard, Greaves said. She paused at the door. Uppity. Will you monitor comms during the operation? He hesitated. It was the first hesitation any of them had seen from him. He looked down at his hands, the scarred knuckles, calluses from fishing line and axe handles layered over older calluses from things that cut deeper. Yes, he said. Hasty Fields. One last time. Inspector Rourke and Sergeant Tremblay arrived 20 minutes later, having driven without headlights down the frozen road, guided by nothing but starlight and Tremblay's knowledge of every pothole. They parked at a distance and approached on foot. What they saw stopped them in their tracks. Greaves's yard had been transformed into a staging area of terrifying efficiency. Spectators moved in the darkness with a fluidity that made them seem less like individuals and more like components of a single organism. Equipment was being checked, rechecked, distributed with the quiet precision of a surgical team preparing for an operation. No one spoke above a whisper. No light was shown. The only sound was the soft crunch of boots on frozen ground and the occasional metallic click of a weapon being made ready. Desiree Fields watching. Rourke stood in the darkness and felt the full weight of his own irrelevance. He had spent a week believing he was in charge of this situation. He now understood that he had never been in charge of anything. The solution had been sitting 800 meters from his command post the entire time, in a log cabin, sharpening a filleting knife and waiting. He approached the porch. Greaves was sitting on his bench, Bishop at his feet, watching the preparations with the calm attention of a man watching his garden grow. Mr. Greaves, Rourke began. Sit down, Inspector, Greaves said, gesturing to a stump he used for splitting kindling. You look like you need to sit. Rourke sat. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then Rourke said, very quietly, Who are you? Greaves looked at him. In the faint starlight, his face was all plains and shadows, the face of the shield itself, ancient and patient and hard. I'm a fisherman, he said. I live on a lake. I had a wife and a daughter, and now I have a dog. That's who I am. That's not what the Chief of Defense Staff thinks. Greaves was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I was someone else once. For a long time. I did things that can't be talked about for people who can't be named, in places that don't appear on maps. I was good at it, better than I had any right to be. And then I came here, to this lake, to this cabin, and I became someone better, a sprout. Someone who plants tomatoes and catches trout and watches the ice come in every November. He looked toward the dark ridge where, in a few hours, things would happen that would never be recorded. Those men up there took a surveyor and 3 of her colleagues, and they're scared and cold, and they want to go home to their families, who are supposed to help them can't, because the tools those men are using to hide were tools I built. My tools, my patterns, my work twisted into something I never intended. His voice, for the first time, carried weight. Not anger, something deeper, responsibility. So I'm doing what I should have done on day 1. I'm fixing what's mine to fix. At 0157, the operators moved out. They flowed across Greaves's frozen fields and into the tree line like smoke, vanishing into the boreal forest with a completeness that made Constable Foss, watching from her cruiser, had ever been there at all. One moment the yard was full of purpose. The next, it was empty. Even their footprints in the frost seemed to disappear. At 0200 exactly, Arthur Greaves pressed the red button. 12 kilometers north, the Northern Shield's communication network died. Radio, every walkie-talkie, every improvised relay went simultaneously silent. The sentries, caught mid-changeover, reached for handsets that produced nothing but dead air. In the main building, and stared at his equipment console as every indicator flatlined. He recognized what was happening. A sync pulse, injection. A technique from an old manual, the one he'd studied in signal school, the one written by a ghost whose name had been redacted from every copy. Impossible, he whispered. He's dead. He wasn't dead. He was sitting in a cabin on Lake Nipigon, listening through his headset. As two assault teams materialized from the darkness, like something out of a northern legend. The operation lasted 4 minutes. There were no explosions, no dramatic firefights, just the swift, surgical application of overwhelming skill by people who had spent their entire adult lives preparing for exactly this moment. The hostages were extracted. Hostage takers were subdued. Not a single shot was fired. The first radio transmission came at 0211. Watchkeeper. Arrowhead. Jackpot. 4 friendlies secured, all accounted for. 11 tangos in custody. 0 casualties. I say again, 0 casualties. Greaves closed his eyes. His hand was still on the transmit button, but he didn't press it immediately. He breathed. In, out. The way he'd breathed for 31 years on this lake, slow and steady. The rhythm of a man who had made peace with everything he'd done and everything he'd chosen not to do. Copy. Arrowhead. Well done. A pause. Then the major's voice came back, and in it was something that transcended military protocol. It was gratitude and awe and the particular sadness of someone who understood exactly what it cost a man like Greaves to pick up that microphone again. Thank you, sir. Everything. Just doing my part, Greaves said. Watchkeeper out. He switched off the radio. The green power light faded. He removed the headset and hung it on its hook, where it would stay, he hoped, for the rest of his days. He closed the door to the back room and locked it. In the kitchen, the kettle was still warm. He poured himself a cup of tea, a spoonful of honey from a jar his neighbor kept bees for, and walked out onto his porch. Bishop followed, and lay down in his usual spot, his heavy head on his paws. The night was clear. The stars over Lake Nipigon were absurd in their profusion, a dome of cold light stretching from horizon to horizon. The temperature had dropped to -15. But Greaves didn't feel it. He felt something else, a quietness inside that matched the quietness outside. The noise was gone. The old frequencies were silent again. Trini. Rourke found him there an hour later, After the helicopters had come and gone, after the hostages had been bundled into warming blankets and driven to the hospital in Thunder Bay, after the last unmarked vehicle had pulled out of the yard and disappeared onto the highway heading south. The inspector walked up to the porch and stood there, hat in his hands, at the old man, the way a first-year medical student looks at a surgeon who has just performed the impossible. "Oh, Master Warrant Officer Greaves," he said. "I owe you an apology." "You owe me nothing," Greaves said. "You were doing your job. You just didn't have all the information. I tried to evacuate you. You did. I spoke to you as though you were, as though you didn't, as though I was an old man who didn't understand the situation." Greaves finished for him. "That's all right. I've spent 31 years making sure that's exactly what people think. It means I'm doing it right." Rourke was quiet for a long time. Then he asked the question that had been building in him all night. "How do you do it? How do you go from that?" Gestured vaguely toward the ridge, toward the operation, toward the entire invisible world of shadows and signals and silent men. "To this?" He gestured at the cabin, the lake, the sleeping dog. Us took a sip of his tea. "You learn to love the quiet," he said. "When you've spent enough years in the noise, the quiet becomes the most valuable thing in the world. Every sunrise I watch from this porch is a gift I gave myself. Every fish I catch, every tomato I grow, aren't small things, Inspector. They're the whole point." He set down his cup. "Go write your report. I'm sure you'll find a way to explain all this without mentioning an old man and his dog." Uff nodded. He understood. Some things didn't belong in reports. They belonged to the quiet places, to the cold lakes and the deep forests and the men who chose silence over glory. "I won't mention you," he said. "I know you won't," Greaves said. "Because if you do, a phone will ring and someone will explain to you why that was a mistake. Not a threat, just how it works." Rourke almost smiled. He extended his hand. Greaves took it. The handshake was brief, firm, and final. Sergeant Tremblay was the last to leave. He walked up to the porch and stood there, hands in his pockets, breath clouding in the frozen air. "Arthur," he said, 31 years. 31 years I've known you, and I had no idea." "Because there was nothing to know," Greaves said. "I'm a fisherman, Henri. I live on a lake." "Right," Tremblay said, shaking his head. "A fisherman." "The ice is going to be good this year," as Greaves said. "Should be safe to set up the hut by the first week of December. You bring the rye. I'll bait." Tremblay laughed, a short, incredulous sound. "You just coordinated a counter-terrorism operation from your kitchen, and you want to talk about ice fishing. There's nothing else to talk about," Greaves said. "The other thing is done. This is what's real." Tremblay looked at his old friend for a long moment, seeing him clearly for the first time, seeing him clearly at last. Then he clapped him on the shoulder, turned, and walked back to his cruiser. Arthur Greaves sat on his porch, his dog at his feet, a cup of tea cooling in his hands. The first faint white light was touching the eastern edge of the lake, a thin line of gray that would become silver. Then gold, a full pale blaze of a November morning in northern Ontario. The stars were fading. The loons would be back in spring. He wasn't watchkeeper, Oppie Fields. He wasn't the ghost who moved through the spaces between signals, the man who built the tools that kept a country safe while it slept. Arthur Greaves, a fisherman on a lake, a man with a garden and a dog, and the quiet, hard-won peace of someone who had earned every silent morning. Bishop shifted, pressing his warm body closer against the old man's leg. Greaves reached down and scratched behind the torn ear. "Good boy," he said softly. "Let's see what the lake looks like today."